Welcome to All About Agatha, the podcast dedicated to reading and ranking every single mystery novel written by the Queen of Crime, Dame Agatha Christie. I am Kemper Donovan, and Happy New Year! It is 2026, and welcome to another listener mailbag episode. I'm so excited to be starting off the year this way. That's right, this entire episode will be taken up reading out and responding to correspondence that all of you have sent me over the last few months. Actually, there's so much to cover that I was going to do this mailbag episode all at one time, but there's simply too much. It would have been hours and hours and hours and hours and hours long. And while I think many of you, well, I know many of you enjoy a 3 to 4 hour long episode about a Christie novel or play or what have you, doing a 4-hour listener mailbag episode felt like a bit much, even for this podcast. So we're going to break it up into 2. Consider this part 1 today. I'm so excited. But first, I've got a blanket spoiler warning for you. We will be covering a lot of ground in this episode, which makes sense since you all responded to lots of All About Agatha episodes over the last few months. So if you're worried about any Christie titles being spoiled, mainly in minor ways, but occasionally in major ways, this is definitely not the episode for you. Also, as a listener pointed out to me recently, so this is really my first bit of listener mail here, but we can treat it as a preamble. We just recently passed the 50-year mark since the passing of Agatha Christie herself. That happened on the 12th of January, 1976. It is now 2026, and that means that we have had 50 years of Christie's legacy, which is just something to sit back and think about for a moment. 50 years. Who knows what the next 50 years of Christie fandom and scholarship will bring? But I am happy to be a part of it, and for all of you to be a part of it, including by way of episodes such as this. So let's get started, and you know how this goes. I'm going to begin with the most recent episode that I got comments on and work my way backward through time. So we will begin with my episode regarding the fictional veterans of Agatha Christie. Here goes. First message. I enjoyed a lot the fictional veterans of Agatha Christie episode and have a possible correction and a couple of suggested additions to your lists. The possible correction regarding NRM. If Commander Haydock is actually the German spy N, then does he really count as a villainous commander, or indeed as a villainous veteran at all? I thought his identity was entirely constructed, so he would be a fake veteran at best. I guess Haydock might have been a real British veteran who had been turned by the Nazis, but wouldn't that contradict the infamous Prussian head reference when he is unmasked? And I will just pause to note that fair-ish point, listener, though I believe that Commander Haydock was, in all likelihood, a German soldier, right? So in that respect, I think he counts as a real veteran, which is why I did not categorize him as one of the fake veterans of Agatha Christie. But I really appreciate your thoughtfulness. Continuing now with the message. In the lovers category, I would have included a mention of Major Blunt from The Murder of Roger Ackroyd. His romance with Flora is one of few happy subplots in what is, when considered overall, a surprisingly sad, dark story for a 1920s Christie. A little bit of love there for Major Blunt. I don't hate that. And then we've got one more suggestion here from this listener. My other suggestion is much more of a deep cut. I'm going to reference the Detection Club collective novel, The Floating Admiral. With the title putting the murdered Admiral Peniston's rank front and center, this is surely the most prominent veteran victim in any book published that includes Christie's name as an author. Of course, one could argue that since she did not write the first chapter introducing us to the murder, this does not really count as one of her fictional veterans. But on the other hand, her proposed solution to the mystery, included in the book's appendix, theorized that the Admiral's nephew Walter was the guilty party. According to Christie, he had been living with him disguised in drag as his niece with nobody noticing. Furthermore, Walter was a World War I veteran who had been declared missing in action and presumed dead. So this book also counts, kinda, as giving us one of Christie's veteran murderers. Thank you so much for this message, listener. I love that you thought of The Floating Admiral, which, you know, if I had thought of it when I was doing the Fictional Veterans episode, I absolutely would have at least mentioned, because you're totally right. It's in the title, The Floating Admiral. And Agatha Christie did contribute a chapter, however glancingly. All right, next message about fictional veterans. I so enjoyed both of your veterans episodes and actually paused listening to the fictional veterans episode to reread The Moving Finger, just to see if I could find any textual clues to Jerry Burton being a veteran. I found not a one, but I thoroughly enjoyed a reread of one of my very favorite Christie novels, and then of course I had the double pleasure of listening to the podcast episode where you and Catherine discussed and ranked the book. In my mind, Jerry is a veteran, but I think that comes from the adaptations and not from the text itself. I noticed that this book did not rank as highly for you and Catherine, although Agatha does consider it one of her best, and I just had a thought that I wanted to share. I think it is an excellent novel to which Miss Marple was tacked on at the end and given a very minor role. In other words, it would have been better to leave Marple out of it, or to give her a more prominent role. Just a thought, as I think on its own, it stands up well to the other first-person male narrator novels that Christie wrote. I know that there are a lot of Moving Finger defenders among you listeners out there. Catherine and I were a little bit more harsh on it than many of you. I still stand by that harshness. I have to say it remains not one of my favorites, even though I have a lot of affection for it. Always a relative statement. Though I will note, and I actually just mentioned this on a recent Patreon episode, I have definitely gotten over my issue in early episodes, an issue that Catherine shared with me as to the series long detectives not being in a certain novel enough, quote unquote, enough. I think it's actually part of the fun not being sure how much Monsieur Poirot or Miss Marple you're going to get from novel to novel. And I was saying this actually in regards to the amount of Benoit Blanc that we got in Rian Johnson's Wake Up Dead Man, which was a lot less than we got in the first two. And that was a big criticism for some people. But I actually kind of liked it because to me, it actually felt like an echo of the effect we get in novels such as The Moving Finger and Cat Among the Pigeons, to use an example from Poirot's canon, in which he appears very late. I actually like that. I don't have as much of an issue with that now that I am older and wiser and here on the other end of my reread of Christie's canon. But thank you very much for that message, listener. And this was not the only listener to weigh in on the Jerry Burton question, because it really is not clear whether or not Jerry Burton is a veteran. And here is what another of you had to say about it. Dear Kemper, I hope you are well. I loved your two-parter about veterans. The question you posed at the end about whether or not Jerry Burton was in the Army is one that I have often asked myself, as there is no mention of the war in The Moving Finger. However, I believe that I have fallen across the answer in Sleeping Murder, Chapter 24. From my reading of Sleeping Murder, it is set in the late 1930s, and the murder of Helen Kennedy would have taken place in the early 1920s, 18 years before. This is one of the books that Christie wrote during World War II and stuck in a bank vault for publication after her death, isn't it? Inspector Primer approaches Miss Marple in the Garden of Hillside, the house where Helen Halliday was murdered, which is now owned by Giles and Glenda Reed. Here is the passage. Miss Marple stood up, flushed and grasping a handful of clinging green. Oh yes, dear Colonel Melrose, he has always been most kind, ever since a churchwarden was shot in a vicar's study, quite a while ago, but you've had other successes since then. A little poison pen trouble down near Limstock. That's the end of the quote from the text, and then this listener returns with, Yippee! I'm sure that this means that The Moving Finger was set pre-World War II in Limstock. Please let me know what you think. Well, what I think about that, listener, is it's a very interesting theory, and I love how deeply you are thinking about the settings for each of these novels. You mentioned that from your reading of Sleeping Murder, you believe it to be set in the late 1930s, and I have to say, I think that is a bit of an outlier interpretation of the time period for Sleeping Murder. You may remember on the episode that I co-hosted with Christie scholar Tony Medawar, in which we focused on Sleeping Murder, that there is a lot of uncertainty, a lot of debate as to when Sleeping Murder was written. And one of the reasons for this is that the play that Gwenda sees in London, The Duchess of Malfi, which in some ways is the catalyst for the whole story, is a very specific production. She references the fact that it stars Gielgud. That would be Sir Arthur John Gielgud. And that means that we can pinpoint exactly when Gwenda went to that play. It had to have been during the 1944-45 season at the Haymarket Theatre, even though Christie says in the book that she went to His Majesty's Theatre. And so that would indicate that the book was at least revised after 1944/1945. And also that the events of the story are potentially taking place right around the end of the Second World War. I would also note that there's no sense to me when I read The Moving Finger that it's not taking place more or less contemporaneously. And that book was first published in 1942. It was serialized in 1942 and then published in the US in the same year, and then in the UK in 1943. So this is why I think the Jerry Burton question remains as sticky and tricky as it is. But I don't have any answers here. That's just my response to your query, and I would welcome others to weigh in on it as well. I'm always happy to read your musings about Jerry Burton. And you know what? I've got another one right here for you. So let's move on to that one. Hi, Kemper. On the Veterans of Christie episode, you asked if Jerry Burton's plane crash was war-related. Such a fascinating question. Sorry for the long email, again. First off, I always took it for granted that it was, until you asked the question. On one hand, why else would he be flying in the early 1940s? But on the other, this book has no mention of the war. There is nothing about air raids, rationing, etc. His crash is only briefly referenced twice in the version I have, more on that in a minute, and both are vague. Miss Barton refers to brave men, and Jerry just tells Megan that he crashed. You and Catherine probably discussed this when you covered the novel, but according to Wikipedia, sorry, it was a quick trip down this rabbit hole, the American version has 9,000 fewer words than the version published in the UK. I have read this book many times and am quite fond of it. At some point I read the UK version and was very confused. I tried to check John Curran's Agatha Christie's Secret Notebooks, but I didn't find anything with a quick search that would answer the question. I think an adaptation changed it so he had a motorcycle accident, and that makes more sense for the time period, honestly. Anyway, I don't think it was war-related since the book doesn't mention it at all, but a plane crash and surviving it at all in the late 30s/early 40s seems unlikely. Thank you for that analysis, listener. It feels like a sound one. Though it's funny, I acknowledge the validity of everything you say, though I think that if I had to come down one way or the other on this question, I would say, it probably was war-related. So the debate continues. All right, here is another listener message regarding the fictional veterans of Agatha Christie. And you know what? This one is from previous Agatha Christie co-host listener Helen Frank, who did such great work with the fictional and real secretaries of Agatha Christie. So here is what Helen had to say about veterans. I wasn't sure if you were including Mary Westmacott in the veterans episode, but then you mentioned Dermot from Giant's Bread, so I guess you were... ... Oh no, I've opened a door here. What have I forgotten? What is Helen about to tell me? Well, something very interesting. Although I'll just note, I think that she meant to say Vernon in Giant's Bread. That is the main character of Giant's Bread, and he definitely is a veteran of the First World War. I hope I didn't say Dermot on the episode. If so, apologies. Vernon is the protagonist of Giant's Bread, whose story mirrors that of Enoch Arden, and he is indeed a veteran. Dermot, in Unfinished Portrait, which is Agatha Christie's extremely autobiographical Mary Westmacott novel, he too is a veteran. And while I imagine there are a couple of veterans scattered over The Burden, A Daughter's a Daughter, and Absent in the Spring, I think that by far the most interesting Mary Westmacott novel as to veterans is the one that Helen is about to school me on here. So let's go back to her letter. You missed the 3 veterans and 1 serving officer in The Rose and the Yew Tree, which is a pretty high percentage when there are only 6 male characters, although I guess understandable for a book mostly set 2 months after VE Day. And then Helen goes through who these veterans are. Captain Hugh Norris, who had been in the Army during the war and was previously a school teacher. Major John Gabriel, VC. Do we have any other veterans with military honors? Helen asks. I think that is absolutely very rare, very notable. Captain Karslake. He became a captain in 1918 in the Army Service Corps and was in the Home Guard in World War II. And finally, Lord Rupert St. Loup. Not sure his rank is ever given, but he is still on active service in Southeast Asia and is in the UK on a month's leave. I'm not in the right circles to know how you address a lord in the military. Maybe he's Captain Lord St. Loup? I'm certainly not in the right circles either, Helen. That is a good question. If one is titled and yet takes on a military rank, how exactly is that dealt with? I would think that the aristocratic title supersedes anything else, but maybe that's not right. Write into me. I'm sure someone out there has a very clear answer to that question. And then Helen continues a little bit more here about The Rose and the Yew Tree, which is a fabulous Mary Westmacott story. Catherine and I did a Patreon episode with Sophie Hannah about it. That one is a favorite of mine. We had a great conversation. Helen writes, of the other two, these are the other two male characters in the story, Robert, Teresa's artist husband, worked in agriculture for his war work. And James Burt, may have been in a reserved occupation as a veterinarian, as I don't think his service is commented on. Too busy being a disgusting human being. Well, thank you for that sick burn on James Burt, Helen, and for reminding me of all of the veterans in The Rose and the Yew Tree. I just didn't think of that one. If I had, I definitely would have mentioned it. All right, we have a few more veterans messages here. Dear Kemper, I enjoyed your Mammoth Veterans Countdown. I'm sure you will be inundated with extras, but mine would be Colonel Easterbrook in the husbands category, hapless on the page, and cut with pig grunts in one of my favorite Miss Marple adaptations. That would be the Joan Hickson one. And the text in question is, a murder is announced. I spent a lot more time on Captain Hames rather than Colonel Easterbrook. I think that is very defensible. I think Captain Hames is a lot more interesting, but I love that someone out there cares enough about Colonel Easterbrook to write in about him. And this listener is not done. He has one more response to my veterans episode. Here goes. But there was one thing almost at the end that nagged at me, and I think the same in your Valentine's episode, and definitely way back when you did Mr. Quinn's stories. The only story on which I utterly disagree with you. I love the mysterious Mr. Quinn, so I'll just give you 2 reasons to reread it again. The issue that nags me is in The Soul of the Croupier. I think you are too generous to the croupier and have the Countess wholly wrong. Mr. Quinn's superpower is close reading, and he even says it at the end. Sticking my neck out, put aside your preconceptions. Sorry to be so bold, but it's the one thing you say that gets me every time. And I'll just pause here because this listener is absolutely right. My interpretation of The Soul of the Croupier is just that. It is an interpretation as to the interplay between these two characters, the titular croupier and the Countess, who he's had a very much an up and down relationship with. That's putting it mildly. And, you know, relationships are complicated, and I love that this listener has a totally different take on the story. I think it shows how rich that story is and how rich Christie's characterization in particular is in that story. It's really become one of my favorites in the Mysterious Mr. Quinn collection. And I know it's a favorite of a lot of others out there. Dr. Michelle Kasmer, for instance, I know she's a big fan. And I feel like we talk a lot about The Man from the Sea, and deservedly so, but this one is also a standout. And, you know, I did revisit the end of the story. There is a different way to read these characters. When the croupier at the end is explaining to the Countess the fact that he has shown her pity, we are told that a mean little smile crept across Pierre Vaucher's face. He raised his hands. Madame, he said, there is such a thing as pity. A mean little smile. So yeah, that would indicate that perhaps the croupier is not totally put upon. Perhaps in some ways the croupier and the Countess are really meant for each other, which is what Mr. Quinn means and what I believe this listener is referencing on the very last page of the story when Mr. Satterthwaite says, that's all gone off splendidly, our pair of lovebirds will be all right now. He, of course, is talking about Franklin Rouge and Elizabeth Martin, but Mr. Quinn asks, which ones? And Mr. Satterthwaite is taken aback. So it seems that the croupier and the Countess may actually get together again in the end. And perhaps by burning that 50,000 franc note and refusing his charity, the Countess has insisted on putting herself on the same level as the croupier, and they are going to rekindle pun intended, pun always intended, their romance? I mean, Mr. Satterthwaite is taken aback by this notion. He says, I suppose you are right, allowing for the Latin point of view and all that. So I just thought that was a really interesting, close reading of the story that definitely differs a bit from my usual interpretation. Not that much. It's almost like the difference is in where the end point of the story is, rather than the journey that we've been taken on. But I just wanted to give that slightly alternate interpretation its due because I love the story so much. And then this listener also wanted to make a point about another short story from the Mysterious Mr. Quinn collection. Here's what he had to say. And I'll just note that this message was written at the very end of last year of 2025. I've just reread the collection because of At the Bells and Motley. Imagine, if you will, what today would look like in 100 years' time. So, with mere days to go, here's to the other end of the telescope from the far-off imaginary year of 2025. And this is such an excellent point, and I remember being amused by this when Catherine and I covered this story so many years ago at this point. But we actually have the year 2025 referenced in At the Bells and Motley. Mr. Quinn and Mr. Satterthwaite are talking about the process of looking back in time, looking at a past crime, which is, of course, something that Christie does in a lot of her novels and that these two do in many of these stories. Gotta love a murder in retrospect. Mr. Satterthwaite suggests that they imagine that the criminal incident in question, we don't have to get into it, has happened earlier that same morning. And this is Mr. Quinn's response. No, no, said Mr. Quinn, smiling. Since, in our imagination, at least, we have power over time, let us turn it the other way. Let us say the disappearance of Captain Harwell took place 100 years ago, that we, in the year 2025, are looking back. Well, we are now officially past the far-off date of 2025. Oh, how time flies. That's just a really fun reference from our perspective, and I really appreciate this listener writing in to give some more love to the mysterious Mr. Quinn and the passive Mr. Satterthwaite. Passive, but observant. All right, I've got one more message about the veterans of Agatha Christie, and this one is from friend of the podcast, Brad Friedman. Here goes. Regarding veterans in plays, the one that came to mind that you didn't mention was Colonel Carberry, who shows up in Act 3 of Appointment with Death to investigate a murder that, quite cleverly for Christie, never happened. But he is a far more minor figure than Major Metcalf in The Mousetrap, and I will just pause to note that Christie's theatrical version of Appointment with Death differs greatly from her novel. This is going to be a big old spoiler here, but in the play, Mrs. Boynton wasn't murdered at all. She actually dies by suicide for purposes of torturing her family over what seems to be her murder. And I maintain that this is one of Christie's best adaptational alterations that she did when adapting a novel for the stage. Back to Brad's message. As for deceased veterans, I started to wonder if Christie didn't have a bit of a trope when it came to the families left behind by a deceased vet. In Nemesis, the Bradbury Scott sisters inherit that old house from their uncle, Colonel Bradbury Scott, who had lost his only son in the war. So, in an oblique way, we can blame all that happened to Verity and Michael to the death of that nameless lad. This made me think that there must have been a similar connection for Miss Emily Barton in The Moving Finger. It makes sense that a widow with 5 daughters would have been left behind by a military man. But, alas, there is no sign that Emily's gorgon of a mother had been married to a soldier. Aside from the lecherous Colonel Appleton, it's surprising how there is no presence of soldiers, even a mention of the war at all, in a book that surely must have been written in wartime. And Jerry's accident seems to have happened to a civilian pilot rather than to a soldier. The only mention of war concerning Jerry comes when he has a nightmare that includes the phrase, "no smoke without fire," which is associated with the wartime phrase, smokescreen. And that's all. On a minor note, I can think of 2 characters who you either didn't mention and certainly didn't need to, or you did mention them and I didn't notice. The first is Major Hector Blunt from Roger Ackroyd, who falls, I guess, into the soldier lover category. He is terribly uninteresting, though. And then there is Captain Dacres in 3-Act Tragedy, who might be more interesting because he is such a jerk that counters, but doesn't topple, your theory of Captain Good, Commander Bad. Just take a moment and imagine Frankenstein's monster saying this as he tosses an officer into the lake. But, like the suspect list in Aykroyd, I've never been impressed with these characters. The murderer is by far the most interesting of the lot in both books. Thank you for that, Brad. I believe that I mentioned Major Blunt and Captain Dacres in passing, like within laundry lists. I definitely did not focus on them. But look at that. Major Blunt referenced twice on this episode. And Miss Barton also. There was a passing reference to her in an earlier message, since we've been focusing so much on the quandary, the quagmire of Jerry Burton's veteran status. So big day here for Major Blunt and Miss Barton stands out there. You know who you are. Let's move on from the fictional veterans of Agatha Christie now to another episode of mine. This is my episode that had to do with two vintage Agatha Christie television adaptations that were recently made available for free on YouTube. So I discussed the pilot episode of a lost American Poirot series starring Martin Gable, and then this short-lived Estonian language Miss Marple series starring Ita Ever. And I had two great responses to that episode. First, I heard from friend of the podcast, Dr. Michelle Kasmer, about a little mystery that I posed at the end of the segment on the Martin Gable Poirot series. I mentioned how at the end of that pilot episode, Martin Gable appears in this little epilogue in character as Poirot, and he teases a few upcoming episodes for the series that never happened, one of which he says involves the killer being caught on the point of a pin. And I couldn't place which Poirot story this was, but Michelle immediately identified it as the short story The Underdog, in which Poirot cleverly uses a common pin as a trap to catch a killer. And I actually noted on the episode that this was one of the short stories that had been flagged for adaptation, so I really should have figured this one out on my own. Thank you for that catch, Michelle. In the story, the pin is a total MacGuffin. Poirot uses it as a means of springing a trap because the murderer thinks that Poirot has something significant, something incriminating, but it turns out to be nothing but a common pin. So when this person is observed looking for the box in which the pin is concealed, he is caught red-handed, which induces him to confess at the end of the story. And this is really notable because Poirot doesn't tend to spring traps to catch the murderers of the crimes that he investigates. That is very much a Miss Marple thing to do. That's how so many Miss Marple stories end, right? She springs a trap and the murderer is caught. Whereas Poirot is much more fond of a spontaneous confession or other means of ensnaring a devious culprit. So I just thought that was interesting that in that story, Poirot was acting a bit Miss Marple-ish. Thanks for that, Michelle. And then I learned from one of you in the course of some correspondence that there is another Ita Ever offering in the Christieverse. This one isn't a Miss Marple. It's a television adaptation of Christie's original play, The Unexpected Guest. This too aired in Estonia in 1993. And it is also available to stream for free on YouTube. I am going to link to it in the show notes to this episode in case you're interested. It looks a little 80s/early 90s, but it's serviceable, and Ita Ever plays Mrs. Warwick, in case you were wondering. So thank you for the heads up on that. All right, let's move on now to my episode all about the audiobooks of Agatha Christie with special guest Gray Robert Brown. I really loved putting that episode together, and I heard from a lot of you about audiobooks. And this shouldn't really be surprising because you all are avid readers, you are passionate readers, and many of you, as it turns out, love your audiobooks. And I love that you shared that love with me. So here goes. This first one is very long. It's a very long message, but very fascinating and very much worth the time that I will take now to read it out. Here goes. After listening with enjoyment to your episode about audiobooks, I have some comments I would like to share. My exposure to audiobooks goes back over 50 years. My brother had dyslexia to a high enough degree that he qualified to get what were called talking books from an organization that served the blind and sight impaired. I forget the name of this organization. These talking books were loaned and sent by mail in phonograph record format at a speed slower than any played by a standard record player. So a special player was also loaned to those in need. One could submit a request list of preferences, but what was supplied was what was available. In our small house, in those days before wireless headphones, earbuds, etc., everyone heard at least some of these books. I don't remember if any were Agatha Christie mysteries, but I feel it is likely. The narrations were of variable quality, some by professional, but some by volunteers. But they provided a useful service for not only the blind, but also those with other forms of sight or other difficulties in reading text themselves. I myself started to listen to audiobooks more than 35 years ago, at that time mainly borrowing them from public libraries in audio cassette format. I listened while driving, and also in the house while doing housework, and also to relax and to while away time when ill. I know that I listened to Agatha Christie. Her mysteries almost always could be contained on 4 audio cassettes, a convenient length, without having to be abridged. I have always hated almost all abridged audiobooks, as I love all the words. All the words was in quotation marks. The versions available tended to be the classic Hugh Fraser, Joan Hickson, and other voice actors from that generation. At that time, the pricing on audiobooks was pretty high, often 3 to 5 times the cost of a hardback book, so relatively few people purchased them for themselves. In addition to public libraries, there were subscription services that would lend audiobooks, mostly by mail, but some at truck stop chains along major interstate highways. Truck drivers and other long-distance drivers could select a title at one fuel stop, listen to it, and exchange it at a future stop. I think that one major thing that inspired the industry to change the pricing structure so that individuals could afford to buy their own was the popularity of the Rob Inglis version of The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings. Fans were pretty serious, and although these long books, even The Hobbit, shortest of the series at 11 hours, was almost twice as long as most unabridged Christie titles, required a large number of audio cassettes, they were pretty popular. When the industry observed that people were buying them for themselves to re-listen, some of the chain bookstores started to offer special editions of unabridged audiobooks by popular authors, priced more like a hardback book, or even less. And as a very popular author with lots of audiobooks available, for which the rights had already been purchased, Christie became part of that trend. I purchased a large number of unabridged audiobooks in audio cassette format new, aiming to pay a price equivalent to a hardback book. The next major change in audiobook listening came in the switch to audio CDs. Some loved the new format. Longer audio cassettes were subject to being eaten by the machine, for example. But I found it a mixed blessing, a bit more difficult to change when driving, and certainly more difficult to move a listen from the car to the house without losing your place. Post-it notes saying Track 24 would be needed. During the time when audio CDs were entering libraries, I was able to purchase a lot of library discards for $1 or $2 when libraries were changing formats. These were the first Christie audiobooks I owned, since I hadn't purchased them new when I could so easily check them out from libraries. Now, digital downloads are the major way that audiobooks are consumed. The prices on CD format audiobooks have come up, in those cases where they are still available in addition to the digital formats, since the volume is now so low. I found myself purchasing again almost all the titles I had previously bought in cassette format and CD format, as the digital format is so easy to use and transfer from car to home to doctor's waiting room, etc. But in addition to the trend to make adaptations of stories as a competition to the unabridged audiobook, the abridged audiobook, and in some cases, including Christie, the historical radio drama versions, there is another new contestant for listeners' ears. In the past few years, a number of Christie's titles have lost their copyright protection in the US. Therefore, there are a lot of different audio versions of these titles now available from Audible US and other US audiobook vendors. Sometimes they package these titles in groups under titles like The Christie Collection, or bundle them with works by other authors, sometimes mystery authors like Tay and Doyle, or just classics, including just about anything out of copyright. I have sampled some of these. Many are pretty dreadful, but Richard Armitage has narrated many of the out-of-US copyright Christies, and I think he does a very good job. At the moment, his readings of those titles, I think currently up to The Murder of Roger Ackroyd, are available to Audible subscribers for no additional cost as part of the Audible Plus catalog. I had already purchased, listened to, and enjoyed almost all of the Christie titles that Armitage has read, but I listened to them again as read by him and enjoyed them very much. Thank you for providing a clip of the new adaptation of Mysterious Affair at Styles. I know I will never purchase or listen to that. And for listeners who find they can't afford to purchase from Audible or any of the many competitors out there, libraries have adapted to the digital age. At least in the US, there are services available from public libraries that provide library card holders with access to digital audiobooks and/or digital ebooks. Two of the most common are Libby/Library2Go and Hoopla. If the local library doesn't have access, explore a bit. There are public libraries in some communities which will allow remote card applications from people who don't live in their communities that will provide access to digital offerings. Look around. There are free options that are within the law. Also, for those titles in the public domain / out of U.S. copyright, like many of the early Christie titles, LibriVox is a free service that provides free audiobooks, most read by volunteer readers. Keep up the good work. Well, thank you for all of the good work you did writing that extremely long message, listener, but that was just, I think, such crucial historical context, and it's what I was trying to provide a snapshot of on that episode because we had so much content to talk about, and it's why I really wanted to take the time here and just read through this listener's 50-year experience of audiobooks here in the United States. So interesting. I really appreciate you sharing all of that information and perspective with me and now with all of the other listeners. That's just wonderful. And it makes me happy that you've been able to listen to so much Christie in so many different ways and in so many different formats over the years. What a journey. Don't touch that dial. We'll be back in a moment with the rest of our episode. We just wanted to take a moment to ask you, our dear listeners, for a favor.
If you haven't already done so, we would very much appreciate it if you take a moment to, give us a rating or a review wherever you're listening to this podcast.
It really helps the podcast out because ratings and reviews make it much easier for other Christie fans such as yourselves to find our podcast.
And the more ratings and reviews we get, the more people we can reach.
It should take you a matter of seconds, and lucky you, we're going to provide you with those seconds right now, so go to it.
Thank you so much. And now, back to our regularly scheduled programming.
All right, we've got a number of other comments about the audiobooks of Agatha Christie. Here's our next one. My favorite audiobook artist is the English actor Nathaniel Parker, Inspector Lynley, etc. Far more expressive than Stephen Fry, whose Harry Potter readings are rather bland and disappointing. Mr. Parker has read for both adults and children, and I'd say 98% of his audio output is very good indeed. He deserves much more recognition for his skill in this field than he has received. I particularly recommend his full, right down to the animals, reading of Thomas Hardy's beautiful novel Far from the Madding Crowd, a true tour de force, and the 8-volume Artemis Fowl series for children by Ian Colfer. The latter are as much fun for adults as for the children. For another long series of children's books, 13, you might also like to try the How to Train Your Dragon series read by David Tennant in full Scots accent. Thank you for those suggestions, listener. I love Far from the Madding Crowd. It's been a long time since I read it. I do remember watching the recent-ish adaptation starring Carey Mulligan. There is, of course, one with Julie Christie as well. But it just might be time to revisit that novel by way of an audiobook. So I think I might take you up on that suggestion. And I have to say, since recording that episode about the audiobooks of Agatha Christie, I have actually listened to a number of other audiobooks. So it's a habit that I am still developing, but I've really been enjoying myself. All right, next message about audiobooks. Dear Kemper, greetings. As a longtime All About Agatha fan who owns 31 Christie audiobooks, I thought this was a stellar episode, and your discussion of Hickson reading Marple titles reminded me of a traumatic experience with our dystopian overlords over at Audible. I once bought 450 from Paddington, read by Joan Hickson, and loved it. It wasn't amazing for the acting. Hickson really just did one voice for everything, and did sound very, very old. Maybe not rushed as much as just an older lady reading a book. But it's Joan Hickson, the best Miss Marple, reading to us. I adored it. But then one day, those bastards at Audible, I'm just reading what I was sent here, swapped out the Hickson for the Amelia Fox, which, no disrespect to Amelia Fox, simply is not the same. I wrote to Audible, complaining vociferously and endlessly, arguing that I bought the Hickson and wanted the Hickson, and Audible in turn reminded me that one never really buys a title from Audible. We just rather sort of rent them, or whatever, or pay Audible to license them to our own devices. About a year ago, this issue came up in the members forum for Caroline Crampton's She Done It book club, and I revisited all my resentment and annoyance at losing access to the Hickson version of Paddington to the extent that another member found a pirated copy stored somewhere online and sent it to me. Hooray for piracy! Thanks for another great episode. And then when I wrote this listener back, because how could I not, here was his follow-up message. One other quick thought. In the episode, you didn't mention the Audible original production of Murder on the Orient Express, a radio play-style adaptation released around the time of Kenneth Branagh's film. It follows the novel very closely and is absolutely amazing. Indeed, the actress who plays Mrs. Hubbard, Jane Asher, really gives Lauren Bacall a run for her money. High praise indeed. I really appreciated that spirited message from you, listener. I can feel the love that you have for that Joan Hickson audiobook version of 450 from Paddington. And your frustration is not isolated, right? Music listeners deal with this as well. The fact that when we subscribe to a site or a service like Spotify, which I use a ton, we don't own the music outright in the same way that we used to. We're merely renting it while we listen to it, and that music is being licensed to Spotify, and it can be taken away. And sometimes it is, and then our access is taken away. So even though audiobooks and the world of digital downloads enhance access to a significant degree in significant ways, it is a little bit of a mixed bag, or it's at least a complicated landscape due to the nature of digital ownership or lack thereof. I think that's something that we're all still grappling with and trying to figure out. It's an important issue to have raised, so thank you for that. And I can't say that I have listened to that Audible original of Murder on the Orient Express, but thank you for the recommendation. All right, here's another one. Hi, Kemper. I love the episode on audiobooks. I'm listening as I write. I knew the name Fenella Woolgar rang a bell with me, and upon checking IMDb, my inkling was confirmed. Fenella Woolgar played Agatha Christie in a 2008 episode of Doctor Who. And of course, this is The Unicorn and the Wasp, the episode in which we get a supernatural explanation for Christie's disappearance. And hey, speaking of David Tennant, he was the 10th Doctor in that episode. So there you go. Thank you for that fun fact, listener. Love being able to make those connections. I wish I had done it myself. All right, we've got 2 more messages about audiobooks. Hi, Kemper. I hope you're doing well. Thanks for another great episode, the one on audiobooks, which I listened to while staining my garden shed. If I remember correctly, you referred to Richard E. Grant as an English actor, which is right, but he spent his formative years in Eswatini, Swaziland, and has dual citizenship. He just sounds English because he's posh. Great actor. A short message, but one of my favorites. I'm so glad that I was able to be with you while you were staining your garden shed, and I appreciate this extra information about Richard E. Grant, aka Leonard Clement in the audiobook version of The Murder at the Vicarage, and just a favorite character actor of mine. All right, my final message is from Dr. Michelle Kasmer. Here is what she had to say about audiobooks. I only found the audiobooks a few years ago, Libby, thank you librarians, and was surprised to discover the extent to which some of the books really came alive in new ways in that format. The humor is funnier, the lies more pungent. In addition, with an audiobook, you are more likely to listen to everything, including parts you might have skimmed over when reading, depending on the kind of reader you are. The Mystery of the Blue Train is one example where I liked it so much in audiobook. That book has more uttered lies in it than even a typical Christie novel, and listening to it really hammers home how much everyone is just lying every single time they open their mouths. It gets under your skin much more effectively as a reader, I think. Another was actually thanks to something Gray said on their pod, that pod being The Swinging Christies with Gray Robert Brown and Mark Aldridge. And the reference on this pod had to do with the clocks. Gray pointed out Christie's use of language to make the whole novel full of clicks and clacks, so the whole novel kind of goes tick-tock. I'm paraphrasing him poorly, but you get the idea. And listening to it really drives it home. I was so glad to hear the librarians, who have been working on Access for decades, get some longitudinal love here. And thank you for the deep love for Hugh Fraser. Of all the impressive things he has done in the audiobooks, I think the most impressive is managing to develop a Poirot voice that is completely distinct from the one he actively performed in dialogue with for decades. I can't imagine how hard that would be. The one book I think is a bit of a struggle is Appointment with Death. Creating 7 distinct American voices must have been so hard. Love it, love it, love it. Thank you for all of that, Michelle. I didn't think about that with Appointment with Death, which I've not listened to on audiobook. I'm going to have to check that out. And I always appreciate some love for The Mystery of the Blue Train. Oh, and you know what? I lied. I have one more message about audiobooks. Here goes. This is a short listener message here, but a good one. It dawned on me as you were wondering why Hugh Fraser deferred to Suchet on 6 of the Poirot books, that each man possesses very different talents. Fraser can do accents without caricaturizing people, while Suchet can switch sexes. That's why Fraser's Ariadne Oliver can annoy some. Not me, because he's my favorite, more so than Suchet. But maybe those 6 books needed the women's voices to be more believable? I heard that's very hard, and I'm not even sure you can train for it. That's why back in Elizabethan times, when the women were played by men, in Othello for instance, a man that can sound like a woman was indeed the toast of the town. That is a really interesting theory, listener. That David Suchet is good at doing, of course, men's voices, but also women's voices, whereas Hugh Fraser does accents better. So it actually wasn't 6 books. There are 5 full-length Poirot novels that Hugh Fraser has not voiced. And one of them is Murder in Mesopotamia, which Anna Massey voiced for obvious reasons because that book has a female narrator. So there are really only 4 novels voiced by David Suchet instead of Hugh Fraser. And they are Death on the Nile, Sad Cypress, Evil Under the Sun, and Dead Man's Folly. I would say that in Death on the Nile, it's extremely important that it be voiced by someone who is adept at doing women's voices, given how important the roles of Jacqueline and Lynette are, in addition to so many other women in that novel. I mean, the truth is that the female characters in Christie are always important, and I'm not sure that I could make the argument that they're of particular importance in Dead Man's Folly or Evil Under the Sun or even Sad Cypress. Although, hey, Eleanor Carlisle is certainly a very important and central character. But yeah, I just think that's a really interesting theory, and it made me sit back and think about it. And for that reason, I wanted to share it with all of you. Thank you for those great reactions to a really fun episode. Really fun for me, and it sounds like it was fun for many of you as well. All right, when I interviewed Stine Just, the Wikipedia administrator for Danish language Agatha Christie articles, a bit of a Wikipedia whiz, we got to talking about death by mushrooms, as one does, because mushrooms, I think, are another topic that Stine knows a lot about. And we openly wondered if there were any Christie books involving poisoned mushrooms. I believe I mentioned 1 or 2 that occurred to me on the episode, but a few of you wrote back with some suggestions, and here goes. You asked if there are any Christie books involving poisoned mushrooms. I looked this up online, as well as racking my own brain, and I think the answer is no, but they have been mentioned several times as a suspected cause of serious illness or death. Books that mention them as a possibility are Murder is Easy, The Thumb Mark of St. Peter, By the Pricking of My Thumbs, 450 from Paddington, and The Secret of Chimneys. But any subsequent deaths are not mushroom-related, I think. I believe that Christie characters took the pragmatic view that if you want to poison somebody, don't bank on unreliable natural poisons, which may not do the trick. Go for a proper poison, like arsenic. The dodgy mushrooms are just there to provide an excuse. Thanks for that, listener. And here's another one of you. Hi, Kemper. Poisoned mushrooms are used as sort of a red herring, again in 450 from Paddington, when the Krakenthorpe family gets poisoned and Alfred later dies. Lucy made mushrooms, and suspicion fell on them at first, until Lucy, who of course wasn't poisoned, said that she ate from the mushrooms as well. And that's right, that is a very good reference point for the use of poisoned mushrooms, even just as a possibility in the works of Christie. Thank you for that. Let's move on now to my episode with Helen Frank, all about the fictional secretaries of Agatha Christie. Okay, so here is where we have a real tour de force from Dr. Michelle Kasmer, one of the very best friends this podcast has. She had a few thoughts and reactions that I wanted to share with you all. I think the first is her most vehement. It concerns the murder at the vicarage, and just know that it involves a lot of all caps on the page. Here goes. How dare you say Miss Cram was unnecessary? Without Gladys Cram, we lack Dennis's ribald rhyme and hilarious couplets. And where else in Christie's mystery novels do we have an almost direct reference to people being so overtaken with lust that they succumb on the floor? I'm just going to let that comment do its thing on its own. I think it's perfect as is. So let's just move along and continue on with Michelle's message. I always think it's worth mentioning when speaking of Thora Grey that Hastings hums and Poirot, in an abominable falsetto voice, sings about her. And it seems to be, please correct me if I am wrong, that Christie wrote that lyrical passage just for this book. It's such a great scene. So the scene that Michelle is talking about is in the ABC murders, when Poirot and Hastings have just had a meeting with the Legion, the group of people connected to the 3 murders committed by the ABC killer. And as they all leave Poirot's, Hastings returns from the door humming a certain tune. And Poirot calls him out on what the tune is. And it really is a great scene, so I'm actually going to read it out. Here goes. This is Poirot speaking first. That tune told me your thoughts. Indeed? Yes. To hum a tune is extremely dangerous. It reveals the subconscious mind. The tune you hummed dates, I think, from the days of the war. Comme ça. Poirot sang in an abominable falsetto voice, and I am not going to do a falsetto voice for all of you. Fear not. Some of the time I love a brunette. Some of the time I love a blonde, who comes from Eden by way of Sweden. And now Poirot continues. What could be more revealing? Mais je crois que la blonde l'emporte sur la brunette. Really, Poirot, I cried, blushing slightly. Did you like my French there? That was for you, Catherine. In case you needed it, since my French was probably incomprehensible, the translation of that French phrase is, but I think the blonde wins over the brunette. And this is notable in that Hastings usually goes for the auburn-haired beauties, right? But here he is clearly enamored of Thora Grey, the beautiful blonde-haired secretary. I mean, he is a gentleman, after all, so I suppose it makes sense that he would prefer a blonde every now and then. Oh, and also the title of this chapter in the book, it's chapter 19, is By Way of Sweden. Love it. Thank you for that highlight, Michelle. See what I did there? Highlight. And yes, I do assume that this is an original song that Christie made up for the book, because I certainly don't recognize it. But if anyone out there does, please write in and let me know. allaboutthedame@gmail.com. All right, I'm still not done with Michelle's message about fictional secretaries, so back to it. I was glad to see in the follow-up that someone brought up the opening scene of A Pocket Full of Rye, which is great. And since I adore that book, I was glad to see it come up. And then Michelle quotes from the book, Grosvenor, Irene Grosvenor. How do you spell it? Oh, like the square. Chef's kiss, Agatha. Even so, you still omitted Mrs. Hardcastle. How like old Percy, thought Lance, to get rid of a glamorous blonde and take on a Gorgon instead. A brief scene, but my God, I adore that book. How dare I overlook Mrs. Hardcastle among all those fabulous secretaries in A Pocket Full of Rye? Thank you for that, Michelle. And then she had a few more secretaries that she thought of. I suppose she's listed as a lady clerk, or clerk, in The Moving Finger, but poor old Miss Ginch, who's 40 at least, with pince-nez and teeth like a rabbit, also winds up as a typist/receptionist, thus secretary, at the house agents. She professes to be scandalized, but is clearly titillated by the whole poison pen situation. And what about Bridget Conway? In Murder is Easy, of course. She's not even a minor character. And this is another quote from the text. Because as his secretary, I get £6 a week, and as his wife, I shall get 100,000 settled on me. And then here's another quote. This is Bridget speaking again. My job as Gordon's wife will be practically indistinguishable from my job as Gordon's secretary. After a year, I doubt if he'll remember to kiss me goodnight. The only difference is in the salary. Good point, Michelle. Bridget Conway is well worth including on a list of the fictional secretaries of Agatha Christie. I think she's one of those secretaries who doesn't quite get remembered as one because there's so much other stuff going on with her. But as those quotations prove, it's absolutely in there. So I appreciate the shout out. Another secretary that I would actually put in this category of one who is a secretary but has so much else going on that you kind of forget about it. This is someone who Michelle did not mention, but that would be Edgar Lawson from They Do It With Mirrors, who is acting as a secretary to Louis Saracold, though by the novel's end, we realize he is much more to Louis than a mere secretary. But back to Michelle's message, her final secretary, who she wanted to mention, is another blondie from the short story The Nemean Lion in the Labors of Hercules collection. And that would be Greta, the, quote, haughty blonde, end quote, who is the motive behind the other crime lurking in the background of this story, which is the attempted poisoning of Lady Hagen by her husband, Sir Joseph Hagen, who was carrying on with his secretary, Greta. And because of that, he is looking to do away with his wife. And as Michelle notes at the end of the story, as a result of a well-timed warning from Poirot, who gives him a very Miss Marple-esque parallel of a Belgian murderer he once knew, who had married his wife to marry a secretary. It's not a village parallel necessarily, but it is a parallel from the past. Poirot just acting like Miss Marple all over the place here in the references I'm making on this episode. But when Poirot does this, Hagen renounces Greta, saying, "I'm not going to risk my neck for any damned platinum blonde." So those are all great catches. And I'll shift now to another listener who wrote into me after the Fictional Secretaries episode with more of a general question. Here is what this listener had to say. I really enjoyed the Secretaries of Christie episode, which brought to mind a question that first occurred to me about 2 years ago when listening to the Dedications of Agatha Christie episode. I'm curious about the logistics of your research when you approach an exhaustive review of a specific feature of Christie's work. How do you go about it? Rely on memory? Leaf through a complete library of physical copies A through Z? Maintain spreadsheets? AI? Inquiring minds want to know. Also, do you personally own a print copy of every single Christie work? Maybe in a mailbag segment, you could tell us about your personal Christie library. What's in it and how is it organized? Well, here we are in a mailbag segment. Nay, an entire mailbag episode. So I figured this is the perfect time to answer this lovely listener query. I'm flattered that you want to know about my process, especially because it often feels fairly haphazard, if I'm being honest. So first, as to my personal Christie library, I think I've mentioned this before, but I am not a collector. I'm not someone who takes any sort of particular delight in owning rare or vintage books, which isn't to say that I'm not fascinated by them, as evidenced by the episode in which David Morris of Collecting Christie came to my house with a bag of goodies, and I couldn't have been more delighted. I love going to museums and libraries and exhibitions and all that, but I'm just not a collector for myself. So I do own every single full-length mystery novel that Christie wrote, all 66 of them. It really only takes up 2 shelves because the paperbacks are so compact. I just own paperbacks of all of them. I have a few vintage copies that have been gifted to me by friends and listeners over the years, all of which I cherish because they were gifts, including a first edition of Death Comes as the End, which I will be reading from when I do my revisitation of that title this year. And I have paperback copies of all of the short story collections, most of the plays, omnibus editions of the Poirot short stories and the Miss Marple short stories, all of the Mary Westmacott's, Christie's autobiography, of course, Come Tell Me How You Live, all the sorts of bits and bobs that there are in terms of what Christie wrote. I pretty much have print copies of all those things, which is very useful because it does make consulting the texts just that much more feasible. I'm not a Kindle person. I don't do ebooks. I wish that I did, especially when I travel, but they're just not for me. And I really do need the texts in front of me. And I'm constantly going back into the texts when I'm doing episodes, and especially when I'm doing those exhaustive reviews of a specific feature of Christie's work. But I should also note that I have a lot of hard copies of the scholarly works about Christie, both volumes of John Curran's Secret Notebooks, all of Dr. Mark Aldridge's books, all of the major biographies, of course, Janet Morgan and Laura Thompson and Lucy Worsley. Those have all been thumbed through so very much, particularly Janet Morgan, so much so that it's actually falling apart at this point. Some of the photographic inserts in it keep on falling out every time that I open it up. But I've got print copies of lesser known reference works as well where Christie is concerned. So I'd say about 2.5 shelves worth when it comes to books about Christie. So almost as much space devoted to the scholarly material as to Christie's work itself. And yeah, when I'm doing one of those episodes, I start with an overview where I try to consider the oeuvre as a whole. I kind of just go through more or less in chronological order the full-length novels and just start getting a sense. I certainly don't use AI. I'm not searching for a term like veteran or secretary or American within some sort of overarching database of all of Christie's works, as evidenced by the fact that I forgot about the Boyntons in Appointment with Death, for instance, when I did all about the Americans, and have all these other, little holes because I am only one brain. But I have learned to embrace that aspect of things, and it's why going through these messages is so much fun. I love knowing that people are going to call me out on anything that I might have forgotten or which they think I've misconstrued or misinterpreted. That's just all part of the fun, but I really do try to be as thorough as possible by going through each and every one of the texts. Going through all of the short stories and the plays gets tough because I think it's hard to keep track of everything that's going on. I definitely had a bit of a hard time keeping track of all of the veterans in the Poirot short stories, for instance, because there are a lot of them and a lot of really great ones. And I'm glad that I made the effort to do that for that episode. But it was a lot of additional work. And I will say that in some of the other single perspective reviews, I've focused a lot more just on the novels because it gets fairly overwhelming when you do more than the novels because Christie wrote so much. And then in terms of online sources, I have been very upfront with the fact that I do use Wikipedia, not because it's perfect. It is crowdsourced by humans. And for that reason, it will always be riddled with all sorts of mistakes. But it's just a very useful tool. And as long as it's being used as one tool among many, I have no problem with that. Even just the article on the English language site for Agatha Christie's bibliography, I mean, I have no idea how many times I have looked at that page because it's a really helpful overview of all of the novels in a nice long list, and you can click on different titles and get a quick rundown of characters or just check like, oh yeah, what was that character's name? Or was that character in this one or that one, etc. So Wikipedia is useful. And then I do have to shout out, I believe I've mentioned this site before, it's the Fandom site, which is another wiki platform. This is agathachristie.fandom.com. It's got nearly 11,000 pages of material on Agatha Christie at this point. So searching for certain terms on that wiki is very helpful, very revealing sometimes, and has definitely helped me to plug some holes. And then finally, as to process, I should say that I have definitely relied on the help of friends from time to time. And I do always try to mention that and to give those friends credit up front. But there are a lot of great agathologists out there who have an incredibly wide and deep knowledge of Christie and her work. And it has been my privilege to be able to confer with them whenever I might need help. So yeah, I hope that gives you a little bit of a sense of my process. Again, thank you for that question, listener. Let's move on now to my interview with mystery author Jeffrey Round. I got 2 messages, actually, about this interview episode. Here's the first one. Hi, Kemper. I wanted to respond to something in your most recent episode, the interview with Jeffrey Round. I think Jeffrey said that there were no 14-year-old detectives in Agatha Christie, or perhaps it was no 14-year-old girls. I just want to give a call out to one of my favorite characters, Julia Upjohn in Cat Among the Pigeons. I can't remember exactly how old she is, but it must be around about 14. One of the things I like about Julia is that when she works out what has happened and finds the jewels, she does the most sensible thing, takes them straight to Hercule Poirot and tells him everything. Excellent point, listener. Julia is one of my favorites as well. And then here is another listener response to that interview with Jeffrey Round. I really wanted to reach out after I listened to your May interview with Jeffrey Round. I am looking at purchasing the Sulphur Springs Cure on the strength of your interview because it sounded like a great read. However, I really wanted to add something to the conversation. As soon as I heard your summary of the Sulphur Springs Cure, together with your introduction of Jeffrey Round, whom I've never heard of, but whom I'm going off to read, as I say, soon, I thought of Timothy Finley's novel, The Telling of Lies. I cannot imagine that a gay male Canadian author who works in theater in the 21st century is not riffing off Finley's novel. Finley was one of the great Canadian novelists when I studied in Canada in the late 1970s and early 1980s. I'm from the Bahamas, and one of his books, Famous Last Words, is partly set in the Bahamas during the Second World War. I fell in love with Timothy Finley's work after reading that, and eventually my two loves, mystery novels and Finley himself, came together in The Telling of Lies. Long-winded way of saying again that I can't believe that Round wasn't writing in response to that novel. There are so many similarities. The Telling of Lies is about a murder at an aging resort with a, let us say, mature female protagonist, and as I listened to your interview, I kept waiting for you or Round to mention Finley's book. The Sulphur Springs Cure pushes the envelope much further. Finley's protagonist has been going to her resort for 45 years, and although it has deteriorated over the years, it's not a ruin yet. But she seems to witness a murder, and she investigates it throughout the book, and so it seemed to me the influence was clear. I didn't expect you to be familiar with Finley's work, as it is part of the Canadian literary canon, but I thought maybe Round might mention him when talking about inspirations. I think Canadian mystery writers can't help but draw on it. I got whiffs of it in some of Louise Penny's work as well, in other ways. Finley would likely have been required reading everywhere in Canada in the 1970s, 1980s, and maybe 1990s, and as a gay male writer with links to the Toronto Theatre, I cannot imagine Round has not read that book. Anyway, just wanted to come by and throw that in. I don't know whether Finley would have been influenced by Christie. He was writing at a time when Christie was dismissed as a serious writer. However, no one who writes a mystery ever does so in ignorance of Christie and of Conan Doyle, and so I think there's probably a link there too. One last thing. It's been decades since I reread The Telling of Lies, and I don't know how it holds up. When I first read it, it became one of my favorite Finley works. If I reread it today, I don't know what I'll think. I've looked, and as an author, he's no longer high up on the list of the top Canadian writers. He's not got Atwood stature, that's for sure, but he was a guiding light at the end of the 20th century. Anyway, just thought I'd mention it. If you've read this far, thanks for reading. I would be curious to find out whether I'm right about Finley's influence on Round. And fortunately, I was able to forward this to Jeffrey Round, and here is his response to that listener. Dear listener, I admire your devotion as both a listener and reader. As you suggest, I'm well aware of Timothy Finley's works, having first read his award-winning novel, The Wars, in high school. Years later, I invited him to write a foreword for the debut issue of the Church Wellesley Review, Canada's first LGBTQ creative writing forum, which I founded and edited. Tiff, as he liked to call himself, was and is one of my writing idols. Strange to say, however, I've never read The Telling of Lies, although I'm aware of it. I have read most of Tiff's books, including Famous Last Words, which you mention. The chapter in which King Edward VIII tries to convince his mother, Queen Mary, to accept his decision to marry the American divorcee Wallace Simpson is probably the finest piece of writing I know of in English. Having recently reread that book and The Wars, I would say they hold up very well, though as you also note, his profile is not as high these days as that of other Canadian writers. I'm told that often happens to a writer's reputation for about a quarter of a century after their demise. Sometimes their reputations are restored due to a revival of interest in their work. Perhaps Timothy Finley's time will come again. We can only hope. As to whether he would have been a snob about Agatha Christie, I can't say, but he was certainly one to encourage younger writers like me with a great deal of enthusiasm. Sincerely, Jeffrey Round. What a great question, what a great response, and I have never heard of Timothy Finley in my life, so now I have another author to get acquainted with, and some more books to add to my pile, and perhaps you all do as well. I thought that little exchange was lovely. And that is the end of part one of my listener mailbag episode. The mailbag is a little less stuff now, but believe me, we have lots more still to cover. But not in the very next episode. We're going to take a break from the mailbag. I'm going to break up those two parts with an interview episode because I was fortunate enough to sit down with longtime friend of the podcast, Sophie Hannah, who has a new book out. It is titled No One Would Do What the Lamberts Have Done. And we got to talk all about it, so that conversation will be up next. And in the meantime, if you are looking for more content, you can always head on over to the podcast's Patreon page. I put up a review of Wake Up Dead Man, written and directed by Rian Johnson, for January's episode. And in February, I will be discussing Verdict by Agatha Christie, her original play, Verdict. Quite a controversial one when it first came out. There's a link to Patreon in the show notes, and you can also find a link to the podcast's Instagram account at All About Agatha, and to my author website, www.kemperdonovan.com. All of that is in the show notes, along with a link for the pre-ordering of the third book in my Ghostwriter Mysteries series. That is titled Sweet Spot. It's coming out in July of this year. Pre-orders are so very helpful to me as an author, so I appreciate all those that have already come in and any that are forthcoming. Thank you all so much for your support of me as an author and also as a podcaster. And one of the best ways to support me as a podcaster is to leave a rating and or a review for this podcast if you haven't yet done so, wherever you are listening to it. Help other people find All About Agatha, and have a healthy and happy new year. Happy 2026, and I'll see you next time. Bye.